Day, God sometimes removes our blinkers. A friend of mine entered her empty church and heard the faint melodies of a choir singing. Another friend saw a monk at the candle stand. When she looked again, he was gone, a glimpse of heavenly reality, serving as a reminder in the midst of her earthbound concerns. Most of us will not see and hear heavenly visitations. Instead, we will experience the usual distractions, as well as moments of prayerful peace as we journey through the liturgy. I have attended Vespers and Compline services with only one other person there. But as Father Lawrence Farley notes in his book, Let Us Attend, the building is still thronged with multitudes of the heavenly host. Our entry into the nave is a step into the eternal present. As we participate in the divine liturgy, may we remember that we never travel alone. In our next episode of the Divine Liturgy Quick Start Guide, we will continue traveling in the second part of the liturgical journey, the Liturgy of the Faithful, and focus on preparing ourselves to receive the Eucharist. I hope you can join me.
The ancient faith for the modern world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Welcome to Live with the Lows with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Lows. My name is Father Nicholas Lowe, the parish priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church right here in Jacksonville, Florida. In fact, this is a ministry of our church, which we're so excited about. And I'm joined by my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Lowe, who's
Good evening, everyone.
She's a clinical psychologist, and we're so excited to be back with you. We've been on a little bit of a break, a much-needed break that we spent some time together with our family, and but we're excited to be back with you on this Tuesday, August 2nd.
Nice to be away, but nice to be home.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we were traveled overseas, and just coming off of the heels of COVID, there's just so many different things that you have to do and prepare for. And so it definitely was great to go, but it's also just amazing to kind of be back in the States. So anyway, again, welcome to Live with the Lows. If this is the first time that you're joining our show, we want you to know that Live with the Lows is a show that marries both faith and psychology to give you some practical tools. I don't know about you, but we're all about trying to find some practicality in our walk of faith. I believe as a priest that it's one thing to give a sermon on a Sunday, but if I don't give you the tools to apply it on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, then I'm kind of not doing my job. I'm doing the things that God's calling me to do. So this show hopes to give you some practicality in your own walk of faith. We air every single Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Ancient Faith Radio. Tonight, before we dive into a really important and scary topic, I want to encourage all of you, though, to stay connected to us by joining us on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. In fact, our sermons are all on the Lows YouTube page and all of our social media platforms. In fact, you can find them under The Lows. It's simply Louhs. That's The Lows. And in fact, our show is currently being broadcast on our Lows Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook, definitely go and like our page and share comments as we're going through our show today. We also want to encourage you that every single day, we send out a little word of encouragement, just a little word of inspiration. And you can, if you're interested in receiving it, you can simply go to our website, which is thelows.com. Top right-hand corner of that website, we have a little button that you can simply click on for subscribe. All you need to do is put your email address, and every day, 7 a.m. Eastern Time, you're going to receive a daily word of encouragement. If you're already receiving these daily words of encouragement, we encourage you, though, to do your part and share them with your friends and family and encourage them to join also and receive these messages. We just want to be a source of hope, life, and joy to the world. So help us in doing that and help us to kind of share Christ's light with this world. And finally, We published a book several years ago called Renewing You, a Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan. It covers about 8 of the most important topics that Roxanne and I see in our practice and in our church. And we hope and pray that if you have received it, you'll share it also with your friends and family. But it's basically just giving you some practicality and how do we begin and strengthen our walk of faith? How do we become better parents? Or how do we deal with those unhealthy thoughts that all of us can have? If those are things that you struggle with, I would encourage you, check out Renewing You. We also have an Audible version that's recorded in our voice that you can find at audible.com. And the book is found right here at store.ancientfaith.com. We would love to hear from you tonight. Your calls are so important to us. So you can call in tonight at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us during the show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. So friends, let's get started. One of the biggest epidemics facing our society today is suicide. It takes the lives of hundreds of people every day. In fact, in the States, every 11 and a half minutes, someone in this country is committing suicide. To be more specific and very practical about this, in the span of tonight's show, at least 5 people will take their own lives. What are the causes? And how can we truly help? Here to talk to you about this topic of understanding suicide is a very good friend of ours, licensed clinical social worker, Susan Zacharias Sanders. Now, let me tell you a little bit about her. She's been providing mental health care for the veteran population for 8 years. Her specialties include substance abuse and suicide prevention. She has a passion for advocating for mental health resources within the Orthodox parish settings, particularly in ethnic parishes where the stigma of seeking care is so prevalent. She's the current vice president of an extraordinary organization that we're going to talk about tonight called OCamper, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. And prior to this role, she served as the co-chair for the Needs Assessment Working Group with the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops Mental Health Task Force. She has also served for 6 years as the Diocese of the Southwest American Secretary for the Department of Counseling Services with the Malankara, the Indian Orthodox Syrian Church. She attends St. Makarios, the Great Orthodox Mission in Chicago, where she lives with her husband. Susan, welcome to Live with the Lows. We're so happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So Susan, let's just begin with just telling us about the statistics. What do the statistics look like for those who are struggling with those thoughts or acts of suicide in the States? And while we're talking about the States, let's talk about it as well as abroad and even among young people.
Yeah, so the statistics that you had shared at the beginning of this call is striking in and of itself. So currently where we're at is 1 death by suicide every 11 minutes. And globally, it's even a little bit more frightening because we're at 1 every 40 seconds. And so that means a ton of people are, if it's not people that are dying by suicide itself, there's a ripple effect because communities, family members, friends, parishioners, and also systems are impacted by the loss that is a result of this real crisis. In 2020, some of the statistics that I found most recently is that we have about 1.2 million people that have attempted suicide. And then that number broadens even larger when we think about those that have planned an attempt to 3.2 million people that have planned an attempt. And 12.2 million American adults suffer with thoughts of suicide. And so when we think about how prevalent death by suicide is one thing. And then we kind of consider folks that struggle with these thoughts of suicide.
Right.
We realize that it becomes even more important to talk about because we can't see thoughts. And so, we see behavior, we can feel and experience the concrete reality of an attempt or even a death by suicide, but we can't always see those thoughts. And so talking about it kind of brings it out into existence where intervention can be possible.
What are we seeing with young people? I mean, I know that we've had people talk to us prior to the show about their concerns with what they're seeing with the young adults and young people in general and their thoughts on suicide.
Yeah, so right now, what we're seeing is that death by suicide is the second leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 10 to 14
Mm.
and 25 to 34. Um, I want to be mindful also that this is not a young people issue, because
Mm-hmm.
in many parts of the world, especially when we expand globally, many older adults are also dying by suicide. And we don't really think of that population as struggling with suicide, but with aging comes, depending on where you live and what your supports look like,
Mm-hmm.
comes a lot of isolation, hopelessness, possibly as medical issues present itself as well. But we know that between the ages of 10 to 14 and 25 to 34, it is the second leading cause of death.
Wow.
Wow. It's really just so sad to hear these statistics as they
Mm-hmm.
are numbers, but they're lives, and
And
it's
souls, you know.
souls,
Mhm.
and it's just I'm just sitting here, emotional just listening to these statistics. I know
Yeah,
that most people listening to this show, with this vast number of people, have been affected by someone that they
Mm-hmm.
know, having struggled with thoughts of suicide, or people, unfortunately, who have actually lost someone to suicide in their family or within their communities. So, how can people, see the warning signs? I think that's the biggest struggle. You always hear, well, we never thought this would have happened to Johnny.
Right.
He's a basketball star. He gets the great grades. Popular kid, always seemed to be happy.
right.
And so I think, there is this struggle with knowing, what do we look for? So how can family and friends, be aware that their loved ones are struggling?
That's a good question because we have this idea of what individuals struggling with these thoughts kind of look like, right? If they're wealthy, or if they're of a certain demographic, or live in a certain location, or have a particular career, perhaps even a stable family,
Mm-hmm.
arrangement, we kind of assume that there's no way they could possibly struggle with these thoughts of suicide, right? And in many ways, unfortunately, we won't know until we ask either. So a lot of the warning signs for individuals are when people have these thoughts where they feel certain emotions that are difficult to know outside of that experience. So when people
Mm-hmm.
are experiencing great shame or guilt, or hopelessness, or really seeing that there is no reason to live. And I think, family members, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, I'm sure, but a lot of times family members and friends and people in the community might be sort of scared to broach that topic, may feel like we're being kind of invasive. And so when conversations head down that path, we may not ask more questions. But
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
the more questions we ask, we may actually discover and find that there is a great deal of shame and guilt. And a lot of times, what I've talked to my veterans about is that no one wants to feel that way, right? That's not a good feeling. Nobody's kind of going around and being like, today, I really hope I feel guilty. Today, I really hope I feel shame. That's not what we want to feel. So it makes sense for us not to want to feel those things.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, for many people, an escape from these uncomfortable, heavy emotions is death, because they can't see the future. They can't see any way out of this experience internally, whether it is those emotions, whether it's a perception of being a burden to others. And physical pain, chronic physical pain, can often be a symptom like, will I ever see a life without this experience? And do I want to live life in this state of pain, physical pain? Those are all sort of thoughts that people that struggle with with thoughts of suicide may have. But you can also notice certain behaviors as well. So
Mm-hmm.
you may notice that a loved one, especially the closer we are with them, we may notice that they start withdrawing from you,
Mm-hmm.
maybe isolating more, and that's not like them. A really big warning sign is when folks start making arrangements to give away important things, important items, or talking about arrangements if they are no longer here.
Right.
One of a big indicator for us when we would work with suicide prevention in the veteran population is if we notice these stressors and then all of a sudden the veteran is arranging writing a will, and then also contacting or researching insurance policies, things like that. When we're really making arrangements for what will the people in my life be, how will they be impacted once I'm gone. So that's a very clear warning sign. And then also just warning signs of mental health distress, whether that's change in appetite, change in mood, change in sleep. Those all signal a reason to ask more questions.
I love the signal to ask more questions and the willingness to ask more questions. I think that our discomfort in society with negative emotions is sometimes we mirror to others that it's not safe to talk about these things because we may be uncomfortable hearing about somebody's hopelessness or somebody's chronic pain. We're
Absolutely.
always, communicating to be strong or focus on the good. There's these sort
Right.
of very typical sayings that we hear. And I think unconsciously we don't mean to, but we sort of communicate it's not okay to kind of share the deeper layer of the
Right.
onion that you're walking around in and with.
Right.
And so I love what you're stressing in terms of that willingness,
Right.
to go there with people and to ask more questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Susan, I want to kind of build on what you said just briefly earlier, and that is about the veteran population. I mean, I know that the statistics there are also just extremely troubling when I'm looking at them right now. I mean, 6,000 veterans die per year. That seems to be just unbelievably staggering. I mean, you work directly with veterans. Can you kind of take us into what you're hearing, what their struggles are?
Yeah. So, something that I have to keep in mind is that in my work, I'm working with veterans that are um, oftentimes seeking care in the VA, seeking health
Mm-hmm.
care and seeking mental health care. And so there is a disproportional number of that veteran population that I see that catches our attention within the suicide prevention team at the VA. And every VA hospital, which is the Veteran Affairs Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
has a suicide prevention team. And so this team is tasked with many responsibilities, and one of which is to provide sort of extra monitoring and extra support for veterans that may identify as being a high risk for suicide. And so there's certainly a great need for it. Funding from the government over the years have just increased because as we pay more attention to this veteran population, we realize that the need is there. So the teams have gotten bigger, services that we're offering have gotten bigger, public health initiatives have gotten bigger. And so it's certainly something that is not seeming, unfortunately, to slow down anytime soon. And at the same time, it is garnering that attention, and therefore the money is coming through, in which case, more interventions can be set in place. One of the things that we see in the veteran population in particular is how ready access to firearms play a direct role to risk, not just the access, but familiarity of how to operate it. So we oftentimes talk about mean safety, which we'll talk about in a bit, but this idea of creating distance between myself and the method in which I might use to end my life.
You're listening to Live with the Lows. We are so excited that you're joining us tonight. We are speaking with Susan Zacharias Sanders on a very difficult topic. We're talking about suicide. How do we just be a voice of hope, a voice of just calm, a voice of love to those that are struggling? And we encourage you and invite you to call us if you've got a question, or maybe you just have someone that you know that's struggling with suicide, or maybe you yourself are just having sometimes these very negative thoughts. Feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we are broadcasting our show live on our Facebook platform on the Lows, as well as on Ancient Faith. So please feel free to share a question or a comment in the comment line there. We'll definitely get to it during the show.
We've had a couple of emails come in we're going to try to get to all of them. I see a lot of questions coming in. So thank you, listeners. This is obviously an important topic. But I think we have to be careful here that, this really can happen to anyone. And we often see, as the email caller is saying, a head scratcher, like the Miss USA pageant winner in 2019, who jumped off a Manhattan apartment building just this year. Seemingly this is someone who would have it all together. We see young kids who are oftentimes, star basketball player, as I said earlier, great student, head of organization, seemingly happy and having it all together. And so I think it's sort of important to consider the risk factors for suicide, to really know that there are some underlying risk factors. We have distress in our environment. And I know a lot of people write in and say things like, well, gosh, when something changes in our life and becomes stressful, is that the cause of suicide? Or as in 13 Reasons Why, the series on Netflix, the bullying, was that the cause, of suicide? And while environmental distress can co-occur with suicide, I think we have to stress that it's not a common response to life's challenges, right? There's already an at-risk vulnerability there, such as mental illness, and maybe even a family history of suicide or prior attempts. But I think it's important to maybe talk a little bit about that, Susan. Maybe could we talk a little bit about maybe some of the risk factors that also, as family and friends, we can kind of be looking out for in maybe a more at-risk, vulnerable population?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you listed and hit many of the major ones. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that suicide is not suicide itself is a behavior. It is not a diagnosis. So I think it goes both ways. Many times people think that all people that die by suicide must have been struggling with a mental health diagnosis, a disorder. And that may or may not be true. And in many situations, we may just not be aware because many folks don't seek care. And so folks may not be properly evaluated. And certainly in that time, there are acute mental health distress that's presenting itself. And with it is a very large risk factor to have family history of attempted suicide, death by suicide. If the individual themselves have a history of attempted suicide, that's a risk factor. And if there are underlying mood disorders, substance use disorders, oftentimes have a high correlation with attempted suicide. And those are really big risk factors as well. And so oftentimes if folks go in to seek mental health care, people may be aware of questions that are asked by their providers on a regular basis. And it may not just be in mental health appointments that folks may be asked those questions, but hopefully now even in most primary care settings, people are asked questions about mood disorders or symptoms that present itself. Are you having symptoms of thoughts of wanting to die, or a lack of motivation, or no longer enjoying things that you once used to? Again, the more we ask these questions in different settings, the more likely we are to be able to route individuals to the right place to be able to seek care.
Absolutely. Once again, we invite you to join us tonight. If you want to have a question for Susan, please feel free to do so. It's 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And I want to welcome to the show Stephen. Stephen, welcome to Live with the Lows.
Yes. Hi, thank you, everybody.
Sorry for the wait. I'm sorry about the wait that you had to do.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Yes, so I'm a cradle Orthodox, and I've struggled for about 30 years with suicidal thoughts. And my comment is to anyone out there that's going through this struggle is don't give up. What has helped me is there's a young man on the internet. His name is Kevin Hines. He's one of the only people who survived the jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he describes the incident that as soon as he left the Golden Gate Bridge, he felt incredible regret. Luckily, he survived, but other people don't. Number one, tell someone, get it out in the open, expose this. Once this is exposed, once you get it out there to anyone, it's a lot easier from that point forward. Because I didn't tell anyone for many years. I struggled on my own. And family members of my family is comes from Sparta. Don't be Spartan about this. Don't just say, "Hey, just fuck up, get over it, just be strong." No. Like you guys are saying, this is crippling. It's devastating. And I just encourage anyone out there to get help and do whatever you can constructively to move forward, because we only have one existence as on this planet. Don't cut it short.
Thank you so much for those words of wisdom. And there is hope, and telling someone and exposing it. I love those words. That is, yes, asking the questions and being willing to be exposing it on both sides. Those are, that makes us feel less alone, right? And one of the leading causes of suicide is feeling alone. With those thoughts, struggling with those thoughts, and being connected but not, in their community, because I'm only sharing the surface layer that everything is fine, when deep down we're not sharing the real struggles. And so, yes, expose it. Thank you so much.
And I think,
for
Stephen,
calling in.
and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Susan, because I think you kind of highlighted that earlier, but I think when there's such a stigma, especially, and he mentioned that his family's from Sparta. I mean, there's such, especially amongst ethnic communities, but really in general, I mean, we're seeing such a stigma towards mental health, although I think it's getting somewhat better in some areas. But he crossed that. He allowed himself to get beyond that, obviously, Stephen did, and share with someone, and with I'm sure with not just with one, but with multiple people about where he was at. I mean, what do you tell the and Stephen, I think after Susan speaks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But to those that may come from an ethnic community where there is obviously a taboo about any type of mental health, much less something as extreme as suicide, what would you, Susan, to kind of guide that person that's struggling with that comes from that community that may feel alone?
Yeah, and I can't really, we can't blame anybody for feeling that way, because I think even in our rhetoric and how we talk about it today, despite having a wider, better understanding that suicide is impacted by so many different factors, our language there's residue from historical times when suicide was illegal. It was a crime, right? It was a crime to take life, including your own life. And therefore it would just not explored as a public health crisis. And so, when we kind of engage in such a way where we don't want to broach that topic, then we perpetuate that stigma without even being aware of it. And which is what happens in a lot of cultures, including the United States and other parts of the world. And so, in many cultures, when people die by suicide, family members may not want to acknowledge it. Friends may not want to acknowledge it. It doesn't get passed on generationally. Therefore, future generations are not aware that there is a history of suicide in their family. And if they were aware, then maybe that's one additional risk factor that they can be prepared for, take measures against to protect themselves. And one of the things that comes to mind as we're talking about different parts of the world and legal statuses of how that has influenced how we talk about suicide. A lot of times we talk about committing suicide, right? But I think even in that language, there's a sort of like a disconnect between the reality of what's happening and how it was interpreted in the past. And so when we say something like die by suicide, we're able to acknowledge that the person that died by suicide, as opposed to applying sort of this a legal quality or a criminal quality to that action.
Stephen, what did it take for you to reach out and say, hey, I need help? What was there a moment?
Yes, I was having a crisis during a work environment. I just felt overwhelmed with stress. I felt I was, there's no way out. It was hopeless. I just needed to leave this world. But something clicked. I believe it was just divine intervention and saying, go get help. and I started speaking to my family. I saw a psychiatrist. I went on medication, and also I wanted to also mention one of my favorite saints is Saint Xenia of Saint Petersburg, which is one of the patron saints, I believe, for mental illness, and also Saint Gerasimos of Kefalonia, who is a intercessor against evil spirits, evil oppression. I asked for their intercession also, so that's also very helpful.
I thank you so much, Stephen, because I think to share your vulnerability on the air and obviously your desire to kind of help other people that may be struggling, like you were and maybe at times still are, and the fact that you share that with us, I know is so beneficial. So, Stephen, thank you for sharing your story, and I hope you have a blessed evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the show. It's incredibly important. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great night.
And I do want to mention for anyone who is struggling or knows someone who is struggling, what used to be the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK is now simply 988. So if you are struggling, the new suicide and crisis hotline is 988. So just like 911, but it's 988. Very easy to remember, and something that I know somebody just also posted it on the Facebook page. So I'm really thankful for that as well.
And so, Susan, as we're continuing this conversation, how does a family member or a friend who's listening to our show tonight, how do they help? How do they help a friend that they know is struggling with, or a family member that's struggling with it? What would you suggest that they do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think probably the question that people find themselves asking, like, what do I do? Because this is so terrifying. There's a couple of things, a couple of places we can start, where we could start. One, as we've mentioned multiple times here, is talk. Talk to the individual that we're worried about or concerned about. There's this myth out there that if I ask about suicide, then people will start thinking about suicide, that I'll be planting a seed. That is a myth. That is not true. In fact, best practice is to not ask the question, are you thinking about harming yourself today? But rather to directly ask the question as directly as possible. Are you thinking about dying? Or are you thinking about killing yourself? Or are you thinking about suicide? Because that gives the person permission, sort of like what Roxanne was saying earlier, that, hey, you're scared and this is your lived reality, and I'm scared and I'm willing to go there with you, right? I'm willing to sit there with you and carry this fear. And then we'll get out of this together. But a lot of times, talking around the subject kind of puts pressure on the individual that's struggling to also not directly address it. So by being direct, we give permission to speak about these things. Like what Stephen was saying, for him, he needed to talk to somebody about it, and people were willing to listen. And part of listening is also to remain curious and to ask more, even though it's terrifying. So that's definitely the first place that I would start with, asking the question, asking a direct question. That 988 number is also a really important number, not only for the folks that are struggling with thoughts of suicide and plans and attempts, but also for family members as well. Family and friends are able to call that number. And what that number does is that it does not go to the police. That's why the number is a different number. But that number does connect people to trained crisis intervention folks. And so you can ask them questions. They'll be able to assess. They'll be able to provide some more guidance. And it's anonymous. And so that's a really great resource as well if you find yourself sort of in a bind and not knowing what to do, to find some consultation.
What wouldn't be helpful then from family and friends? What would you say that we should not be doing?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we should not be doing. One is avoiding, kind of the flip side of asking that direct question, is avoiding those questions, avoiding the topic out of fear. It takes insight to realize sometimes that is what we're doing. But not asking those questions is something that is not helpful. And the other thing is not promising our family and friends that we won't tell anybody. I think that's sometimes a trap that we can fall into. Sometimes people might ask us, I will tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone. And an appropriate response can and possibly should be is, you know, your privacy is important to me. Your confidentiality is important to me. And if I have a reason to be worried, I want to make sure that you get the help that you need. So I may need to seek help. I may need to ask for assistance. So that's the other thing that I would say. Something that I didn't mention earlier about what family and friends can do is a little bit of the means safety we talked about before. If there are individuals that are talking to you after asking these questions and having this conversation, they say, hey, I really have these thoughts of using, taking those medications in the medication cabinet. Create distance. Talk to the individual about how to change the environment so we create a physical distance, a time-based distance between that individual and access to those means, whether it's a firearm, whether it's medications, whatever it might be. Remove them from the setting, because that buys us time, and time does save lives.
Mm-hmm.
You're listening to Live with the Lows, and we're speaking with Susan Zacharias Sanders about depression. And I know it's a heavy topic for all of us to be talking about, but we just wanted to really dedicate a show to helping those who are struggling, or those, and just for family and friends who have family and friends who are struggling with this. Susan is a licensed clinical social worker who has extensive experience and knowledge, and works directly with those who are struggling with depression, and more importantly with suicide. And so we thank her for being with us tonight. We invite you to call in and speak with Susan directly. You can call her at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can email us a question, which I know we're getting a lot of email questions, Roxanne, at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And before we get to some of those questions, I do want to remind all of our listeners that if you have not registered to receive our daily inspirational messages, go to thelows.com. In fact, do it right now. Just go to thelows.com, click on that subscribe button, and every single day we're going to share with you a word of hope and a word of love and encouragement. So please take advantage of that.
So let's talk about, what's available, what interventions are available. If you're someone who knows someone who's struggling, or if you yourself are struggling. I know an email has just come in here about a couple of things that they used to help with their seasonal affective disorder, which is seasonal depression, was creating suicidal thoughts. They used a light box. There's so many interventions that are available, but what is available to give people hope, Susan? What would you say?
Yeah, so interventions can look different in different settings. So, I would say means safety precautions is an intervention, creating distance from the physical items that we may find ourselves, kind of wrapped our thought. For folks that may think about how to die and have a plan, creating that safety net, creating that distance is an intervention. A lot of times, if folks are engaged in mental health care, they may hear of this document called the safety plan. And basically what the safety plan is, and you can find a safety plan just by Googling a safety plan worksheet. It's really quick and simple. But it basically creates an outline of folks to contact in moments of crisis. And so sometimes when we're in that headspace, we can't rationally think about next steps. And so a safety plan is a concrete place for us to reference what can I do when these symptoms come up. So safety plan usually says, it outlines what are my warning signs, who do I call in times of need. It asks us to list 3 or 4 people. If talking to those people don't help, what do I do next? What can I do to change my environment? As well as some crisis numbers as well, and information about a local hospital if things get to that point. Sometimes folks struggle with chronic thoughts of suicide, where it's not so acute and in the moment, but sort of have this perpetual state of wanting to die, and these thoughts of hopelessness come in, but no actions or plans have taken place. In which case, there are oftentimes a reason for that experience. Oftentimes, perhaps an undiagnosed mental health disorder,
Right.
in which case, starting with the provider that you see, seeking your primary care counselor, getting a referral to a mental health provider, going on the Assembly of Bishops website to find the Orthodox therapist locator, or going on your insurance website to find providers that are covered within network. But basically, just getting in the door to starting treatment, at least an assessment is helpful. And within that avenue, there are many different interventions that may take place. There's cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, depending on what the primary diagnosis is. There may be suicide prevention interventions built in to different sort of psychotherapy interventions.
Too, I was just going to share a little bit, with our listeners as well, Susan. I'm sure you would echo the same stuff with regards to, letting your parish priest or someone that, will obviously be able to kind of give you some guidance, maybe just even to lead you towards getting the help. But I think one of the things that, like so many struggles that we have in life, is that we tend to do what Adam and Eve did, we see in the very first book, in the very first chapter of the Old Testament, where they hid, and sometimes when we're going through a struggle, we can hide, we can kind of just, and I think in some ways it becomes a spiritual battle at that point, I believe, where we are when we hide, we tend to withdraw ourselves. We feel like we're all alone, and in those moments of feeling alone is where I believe that one of the areas where the devil speaks the loudest. I oftentimes tell our church family that the enemy will always speak the loudest when we are the weakest, or when we're the tiredest, or when we're the loneliest. And I think that's where I think it's so powerful to let your parish priest know, let some sort of a mentor, someone that you look up to, let them know what's kind of going on. And I think so beautifully stated earlier, and I think it's been echoed by Susan as well, is the importance of having a network of people that you can lean into, people that are not necessarily commiserating with you or going through the same struggle that you are, but people that you can feed you and can guide you to getting through this. Because throughout the Bible, from the beginning to the end, from Genesis to Revelation, there's this constant message of we were never created to be alone. We were created to live in community. Why? Some of the reasons are just for this, so that we have people that we can lean into and guide us. The Bible says a beautiful verse. It says, when you stand alone, you easily fall. But when two are gathered, it's much more difficult to fall. And so I would make sure that you have that second person, that third or fourth person that's there to kind of guide you through that. And please, lean into someone and to make sure that you're communicating. So we're definitely just encouraging you with that. Let me ask you this, Susan, as we're kind of continuing this conversation. I know we've got a few minutes left in our show. This seems kind of dramatic, but at what point would you tell, one of our listeners today to call the police? I mean, at what point would you say, this is something that I don't need to keep just dealing with on my own. I need to escalate this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of times when folks are unfamiliar with how to navigate the suicide risk of a loved one, I think we kind of think in black and white that if I start talking about this, I have to bring them to the emergency room. I have to call the police right away. And there's certainly a time and place for that. And that may not be the first step, right? But I think it's worth talking about when it is appropriate to call the police. And oftentimes that's when you may have had a concern about somebody most recently, and then kind of said, hey, I'm going to check in on you tomorrow, which I would recommend folks to do. Like, hey, you sounds like you're not doing so well. It sounds like you're willing to kind of do some things to make yourself feel better, get out of the home, come over, whatever that might be. And then we offer a phone call for the next day, right? Say, I'll call you tomorrow to check in on you and see how you're doing. And say we haven't heard from somebody for quite some time, and we call their other contacts, maybe their parents or other loved ones, and say, hey, have you heard from so-and-so lately? I know he or she was really struggling the day before. We may go over and we may not get a response. Those are reasonable, reasons to contact the police to do what we call a well-being check, and just make sure that they're okay. Another situation might be if a person says, I am not okay. I don't think I can be alone. I don't think I can stay safe tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what I would do if I'm by myself. That's a reason to bring the person into the emergency department and get acute intervention. And then, of course, the other thing I would definitely mention is if we know that somebody had just attempted suicide, call the police. That's we do not want to waste any time in that matter.
Sure.
So we have an email question that came in, Susan. I want to get to. I know there's so many. I'm trying to kind of read through them here, but our writer says, how can a parent of an adult child who is struggling with suicidal thoughts help them in light of medical privacy laws? My adult child has done some non-Christian counseling, and that seems to have somehow only worsened the depression and alienated our child from us through blaming the family for everything that the child is struggling with. And so the parent is writing, how do we help in sort of this situation? What would you suggest, Susan?
That is such a tough question. And I can appreciate the caller's sort of concern with that because privacy laws are real in the country, and especially, after 18. People don't have to authorize their parents to know about their medical situation, right? What I would recommend is talking to the child about what would be most helpful from the child's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Though 18, 19, 20, though legally an adult, the parent is still a parent. And perhaps what the child may need is to feel comfortable that they can come to the parent when they want to, and not necessarily when the parent wants to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there are situations put in place, and a lot of providers will ask their patients, who do you want us to involve in your care? And so if the adult patient says, I would like to involve my mom or my dad in my therapy, that individual signs a release of information, and depending on what their limits are, as dictated by the patient, they can involve their parents. But sort of the autonomy comes from the child at that point. And so I would open that door and have the child ask the adult child, in what ways can we be helpful to you as you navigate this? What is not helpful from us? It may be constantly asking questions, right? It may be, there may be something there that the adult child does not want, and therefore does not open the door for discussion about many things with.
Yeah. That's so helpful. We actually have another call in. This is Corey calling from Hawaii. Corey, welcome to Live with the Lows. Corey, are you there? Oh, they may have hung up.
All right. So I love that response, Susan. And I'm a big fan of invite them in, right? I mean, so those questions and those conversations are great and sometimes easier to maybe even be had in front of the counselor helping the child, so never be afraid to ask, can we come in to find out what we could be doing to be more helpful? And it becomes a, you tell us sort of conversation, but, with the help of even a therapist, because those privacy laws, although wonderful, sometimes do inhibit what I would say family who really do intend well and want to help and know how to help. And counseling genuinely provides support, hope, understanding, problem solving, and lots of conflict resolution. So don't be afraid to kind of welcome yourself and step into the door.
Right. So I think Corey's back on. Corey, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to Live with the Lows.
Thank you. So I have some experience with preventing suicide. I've stopped 4 people from killing themselves. There are a couple of things. One thing I don't think you guys mentioned was that one thing that you do not want to do when talking to someone is you don't want to tell them what to feel and what to do. So you don't want to say like, well, you should feel this way because this is going to happen or this is going to happen, or you should really think about other people. That's not necessarily the right way to go about doing it. The best way to stop somebody, in my experience, is through empathy, listening, active feedback, not contradicting, just letting them know that, like, okay, I'm here for you, and let's see if we can work through this together. Second thing is a good resource is 741-741 texting the suicide hotline. And so you just text like home to 741-741, and they have trained volunteers 24 hours a day. It's completely free. And you can use that as a resource if you don't want to call in and talk to somebody. Texting is a little bit more private in that matter. And I think a lot of things, a huge risk factor too, is alcohol and drugs, especially alcohol. And I know with bipolar patients, alcohol is the drug of choice. So you really have to be cognizant of that and really try and remove those things from the situation. That's all.
Thank you, Corey. That's so helpful.
Great.
Susan, to Corey's point, I mean, I think that, empathy and really journeying and stepping into their shoes and walking with them. I mean, maybe speak a little bit more about that and how important that is for us to have, as opposed to always just simply telling people how they should feel, which is, I think, so much of a knee-jerk reaction. It's almost our way of our own personal uncomfortability with that situation, and we tend to use that uncomfortability that we have by simply telling them how they should feel.
Yes, absolutely. It goes back to how we started this conversation in the beginning is, sometimes we can't imagine why somebody would struggle with these thoughts because we perceived our lives in a certain way. This is not an opportunity to figure out our own discomfort and our own inability to comprehend that. This is an opportunity to better understand who's in front of us, who is a complex human being, as all of us are, and to be curious about their lived experiences, both the good, the hard, the difficult, and the bad. And so being able to respond with empathy by saying, this must be very difficult for you. I can't imagine what this is like, instead of saying, there's no reason for you to feel this way. Think about your family. Think about XYZ. A lot of times folks that struggle with these thoughts are thinking about all of those important factors and still kind of arrive at this conclusion. And so I think it's important not to infantilize individuals that struggle with these things, to not be patronizing, but rather be present and be willing to listen to the very difficult things that they're experiencing internally.
I love that. Thank you so much, Corey, for calling in, and give all of our love to everyone in Hawaii. We're so excited that you guys are listening to us as well. In the last few moments of the show, I wanted to ask you, Susan, I know at the top of the show, we had mentioned that you're the vice president of a great ministry that I think everyone should know about. It's called OCamper. It's the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. Can you tell us a little bit about this ministry and where people can find out more about it?
Yes, I would love to. So you can find out more by going to ocamper.org. So that's just OCAMPR.org. And really the point of this organization is to build fellowship, to network with one another, to learn from one another, of professionals that are in the fields of medicine, psychology, and religion. We're most commonly known for our conferences that are held once a year in different parts of the country. This year, we're holding a conference from November 3rd through the 5th. And it will be held in Glenview, Illinois, and registration is live and available. And our very own host here is the psychological plenary speaker, which we're really excited to have you, Roxanne, this year.
So excited to be there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great conference. And this year's conference specifically is titled Living Liturgy and Practice, Orthodox Care in a Rapidly Changing World. And so if we have any listeners that are in the field of medicine and psychology and religion, please check out the website. We're known for our conference, but we're certainly making attempts to find other ways to create networking opportunities and build a community within the larger Orthodox community here.
I love that. Susan, I love what OCamper does, what it represents, and I love the fact that we have that. And I love the fact that it's a Orthodox Christian association. In other words, it's something that the church, which it has always as accepted and acknowledge that the struggle that people have with physical, mental, and emotional health. And I think all of us at some point or at some stage go through our own seasons. I think that's why the Bible spends so much time talking about the power of our thoughts, the power of preserving and taking care of our body. And I think having an organization like this, ocamper.org, and I'd encourage all of you to find it, is so powerful for our church in general, for Christianity in general, because for so long, I think issues and topics of people's health and mental health, especially, were always considered to be something that we would not talk about. It was just considered to be stuck, kept within the house, as some might say, or kept within the confines of the family. So I love that, and I encourage all of our listeners to definitely check out the site. One final question, and this is just kind of a little bit on my heart. As I'm been listening to the calls, reading the emails, and sadly we weren't really able to get to all the different emails. I mean, we have so many emails, and just so our listeners know, next Tuesday we're dedicating a show really to what we're calling Coming Out of the Darkness, and we're dealing with the show specifically on depression, and so it's called Coming Out of the Darkness. We encourage you to join us next Tuesday for that show. But as listeners that are tuning into our show, or maybe even downloading this as a podcast later, if they have a friend or a family member that they're really worried about, and they're worried about them hurting themselves, or that they're just struggling themselves with what to do right now, what would you encourage them to do if they've got a family member, a child, a friend who's just, they believe is just in a very dark place? What would you tell them to do right now with them?
I would right now continue to keep the line of communication open. Maybe spend extra time with them so that they know that that they have somebody to reach out to. I think it was mentioned earlier in this call that we are inclined to hide and isolate when things get difficult, and that's when evil strikes. And so, if we know that there's somebody in our lives, in our community, that's struggling, it's a perfect opportunity to set up a time for coffee, or take them out for the weekend, or let them know that they are valued and loved by you, and start having some of those conversations. If you notice something, ask what you've noticed. Ask about what you've noticed. That, hey, I've known you for X amount of years or months, and things seem to be difficult for you. What's going on? And let them know that you're available. And like I mentioned earlier, that 988 number, as the crisis sort of elevates, if you find yourself in that situation, that 988 number is not just for individuals that are struggling with thoughts or making plans, but also for family members and supportive loved ones.
That's awesome. I definitely encourage all of our listeners, if you have a friend or a family member that's going through that, take advantage of calling that number.
Reach out to your priests, to your teachers if you're listening, if you're a young student, a coach, a trusted adult mentor, a parent, of course, a mental health counselor. Go anywhere. Your local emergency room can even do a comprehensive eval. Just expose it. Don't let it wait past tonight. If you've been struggling, this is the time. Let this be a transformational moment for you, to reach out and to stop struggling alone, because there are so many people waiting to walk that journey with you.
Thank you again, Susan, for being on our show. We are so excited to have you. We'd love to have you come on again, perhaps sometime in the very near future. But I know that your words were so beneficial. I know they were enlightening for us, and just so beneficial, I'm sure, to all of our listeners. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And definitely check out this website, Ocamper, OCAMPR.org. It's a great, great website. We'll share with you all about the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. I want to take this opportunity to thank our amazing producer of tonight's show, Matushka Trudy, who just does an extraordinary job every single Tuesday producing our show, and all the great people at Ancient Faith. We love being part of the Ancient Faith family. And if you've enjoyed the show, we encourage you to join our social media platforms, again, all under the headings of The Lows and then receive our daily words of inspiration by going to thelowe's.com and simply clicking on the subscribe button. Put your email address, and tomorrow morning you'll receive a little word of encouragement from Roxanne and myself. Again, thanks so much. And next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about building on this conversation that we had tonight, coming out of the darkness of depression. So definitely tune in and invite a friend and family. God bless you all, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelowe's.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Lowe's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with The Lowe's is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Are you curious about the Orthodox Christian faith?
Do you have questions about Orthodox Christianity that you can't trust strangers in internet forums to answer?
Are you an Orthodox Christian looking for a reliable first place to send your interested friends?
Do you need help finding an Orthodox church near you? My name is Father Paul Hodge.